So we'll kick off this Kickstart conference with 4 keynote talks. The last keynote will be from Europe on the digital market, but we'll start with 3 Outlook keynotes. Outlook on internet connectivity, Outlook on data center market, and of course Outlook on cloud market. We'll start off with the Senior Director Network at Technology at Akamai, and he'll be talking about Outlook internet connectivity. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Christian Kaufmann.
Does it work now? Good morning. Now it might work. Oh, good. Can you hear me all? Also in the last rows? Some people. At least it seems to reach till the middle of the room. Good. Let's see if I'm more successful. Not yet.
Yeah, that's you.
That's me. I've seen that one. Good. Good morning. I got a friendly invite which I couldn't refuse to talk today about internet connectivity. So here we are. The presentation today, or what I'm talking about, is from the view of Akamai and the CDN. But most of the stuff is true for pretty much all the other over-the-top traffic companies as well. So whatever, a Google, Facebook, Netflix, the Fruit, which doesn't want to be mentioned, and all of the others, they have very similar behavior. Before we start, is everyone aware what a CDN does, roughly? Not that I lose you on the first slide. Who does not know what a CDN is? Okay, we should quickly talk about it. There are basically 2 parts of a CDN. There is a technology, and we'll talk about that quickly, which is aimed to distribute content. So mainly we talk about websites, downloads, video, that kind of stuff, as close as possible to the end user. This is all of us, the eyeballs, the ones who are consuming the content. So whenever you open your phone or your computer, you usually download something, watch a website, look at a video, and all of that content has to come from somewhere. And the quality and the throughput is better if the servers are actually closer to you. So what a CDN does is they distribute that servers around the world and hopefully as close as possible to you, so you have a good user experience. There are 2 kinds of CDNs. They are the ones which are owned pretty much by the company. So Google, Netflix, Facebook, for example, they have a CDN, a distribution platform, but they use it for their own content. And then there are third-party CDNs, as we are one, where companies who which have the content but not the platform can basically use our platform. It's a service like an ISP, just the other side of the metal, and then that content gets distributed from the CDN. So far so good? Some nodding. Some figures, the marketing slide, to give you a rough idea what that means for the, CDNs which are highly distributed. So in our case, we are in 130 countries in the world, so this is as close as possible for most people on the planet. And as we talk about I-axis a little bit later, we are at 130 I-axis. But these are roughly the numbers the other big players would have as well, at least same order of magnitude. There's an interesting and important concept which we will talk about later as well, which is called on-net. That's at least the Akamai term. Funny enough, Facebook calls it off-net. Google calls it the Google Cache, and Netflix called it the Open Connect, and whatever the other people calling it. The concept is that you take servers from that particular company who want to distribute the content, and you don't put it at an IX or in a data center, in a carrier neutral one, but you give it to the eyeball provider. So whoever is your DSL or your cable provider might have these servers then from that particular company in his own data center, and then you get served from there. So instead of, which hopefully is even in the same city, certainly in the same country, so instead of that your request goes far away over the ocean in another country or over in another continent, it stays in the provider's network. It is on net. And the majority of the big content is delivered like this, but we come to that in a second. Very quickly, data center landscape. So this there are more data center types, and I'm aware of that, but for argument's sake and for what CDNs at least use, and also the cloud people, I think there are two fundamental concepts. One is you have a computing data center. So these are the ones you read in the newspaper about it when someone buys a big factory next to a water dam for the power, or on a green field somewhere in the middle of nowhere, but with cheap power. And this is usually for computing. So big companies like the cloud providers, or the ones I mentioned here, they are moving there, and they have literally 10,000s, 100,000s of servers in that location, but this is mainly for computing. So they store things, they compute, but the interconnection density is not particularly high because it is on a green field far away from the rest of a metro area potentially. Therefore, not many other providers are going there, and usually that particular provider which is owning the data center is then taking care about the connectivity in and out. The other ones, I call them interconnection data center for lack of a better term, are the ones which are in metro areas. They're usually the carrier neutral one. I have chosen two random companies. And this is where the interconnection density is very high. This is where all the ISPs are meeting, the CDNs, and this is where you get the cross-connect, the internet exchanges. We'll look at that in a second. This is where you interconnect. So, what are the different models of interconnection? Well, as I said, you have the on-net concept, where you put the servers in the network, then you don't have to go over a network boundary into another network. You don't rely on another transit provider or anything. You basically have it in the same network. You have PNIs. These are the private network interconnects. So this is usually a cross-connect in a data center. So if you have a data center, this is usually what your tenants are doing. You have two networks, they want to connect, they come to you for a cross-connect, they meet in the meet me room, and then they have whatever 10, 100 gig connection between them, and then they exchange data. But it is two parties, it is the two parties you connected together, and exactly these two are exchanging then the traffic. You have internet exchanges. This is this one-to-many connection model where you can go and you join an internet exchange, or you buy the service depending on what their business model is, and then you can reach all the other ones. It's a layer 2 platform, basically a cross connect from one to many, and then if the other party want to peer with you, then you can peer with all of them. If you look at the very big ones, I've seen some AMS6 people, then I think you can reach 600-700 people or so, or networks at one with just one cross connect. So this is then a shared infrastructure, but you can reach a lot at once. So if you have low traffic volumes, then this is usually what people do. If you have very high traffic volumes, then at a certain point, from an economic and technical perspective, you move them to PNIs. So it is not so much that you have exactly one of these models. You usually have a mix out of them, depending on who you want to reach. And of course, the last one is transit. If you don't peer, if you have no interconnection, you usually need a transit provider, otherwise you're not even on the internet, so this is your last default. This is also how you reach the rest of the world, because even if you go, now we make advertisement for AMS6 again, hope I get a coffee out of that. When you connect to them, you just get a certain amount of prefixes, you don't get the whole world. So you get a big subset of it, but not everyone. So to reach the rest of the world, if you're a provider or have content, you need a transit provider. Good. That was the first introduction, quickly. So now let's have a look a little bit slower how the market looks like and what we certainly see from a CDN perspective. I think it is not much of a surprise that the majority of the traffic, and there is that magic 80% is video, 90%, whatever it is, doesn't actually make a big difference, but the majority of the volume of what is transported in the internet, regardless if that is now transit, internet exchanges, is basically content. That usually includes all these video download web pages in whatever mix. not sure if you were aware of it, but pretty much 80% of all of that traffic comes actually from 10 networks. You can guess, probably the big 5, 6 ones. And then it depends a little bit on the variation of the country, what kind of flavor they have, and who are the other 5. But if you see statistics of the network, Kentic gave a presentation last year, which I think is public, where they showed that as well with graphs. Then you see it is not much more than 10 networks. So we had in the last couple of years, or certainly in the last decade, quite a consolidation on where the content is and what people are actually doing and watching. To deliver that content, especially for the very big players, like the 10, roughly the 10 I mentioned, they are working with the on-net model. So all of them have caches, and they do that to one or the other degree, put them in the eyeball network, and then you get actually mainly served from there. The remaining part they can't solve via that method, comes then via PNIs, the private interconnect in the data center, and actually the rest goes to internet exchanges. So what we have seen in the market is that the traffic on the internet exchanges and on the transit is actually growing slower than the rest of the market. If you look at the big internet exchanges in Europe and you look at their traffic graphs, which were published certainly till today, then they are flatlining, more or less, you know, for at least the last 12 months. So they get a lot of new members as well. So it's not that they're not growing from a prefix or from a network perspective, but if you look from a volume perspective, the traffic is actually more or less flat. So whenever a big player has too much traffic, too much volume, they usually move them to PNI or on-net depending on their capabilities. What does that mean for the internet exchanges? Well, we have a slide for that later as well. I guess that's a good question. I don't think they go away from the ecosystem per se. I think they're an important part for the ecosystem, but they are more used for what we call the long tail, so smaller providers with less traffic potentially. And I guess they are certainly more used for low traffic volumes, and then the big ones are getting moved off either to on-net or PNIs. Another trend we have seen, which is quite interesting, is the interconnection between the clouds itself or the clouds and the CDNs. So in the past, the majority, for example, of our customer had their own servers somewhere in a hosting, and then we basically fetch it as a CDN, distributed all over the world, and then delivered out to the eyeballs. And that was pretty much the same for the other CDNs as well. But now, these days, actually more and more, we call it origin traffic, the traffic from where it originally comes, doesn't come so much from a hosting platform of the traffic owner anymore, because they actually put it in the cloud. So I tried to make that in a very simple drawing. You have the content owner, whatever they might have, videos, web pages, downloads, any kind of content, and they put it via a cloud on-ramp. If they are already in a data center, that's a cross-connect, or you have random companies mentioning too, like a Megaport IX Reach, which help people to actually reach the cloud. They load it into the cloud. You can imagine like 3-4 big players, and from the cloud, then it has to be distributed. And you can either use the CDN from that particular cloud provider. Most of them have an own CDN product and then deliver it. Or you can take a third party, like ours, for example, and then it goes from the cloud via a PNI, via cross-connect to the CDN, and then the CDN distributes it via on-net or PNIs, as I described before. So if you look at that model, the majority of the traffic actually never hits the public internet. It goes via PNIs and various methods and bypasses to a big degree transit. It bypasses to a big degree internet exchanges. So you can have actually a discussion if that is still the internet, because till at the end, when it falls out of that construction and it gets delivered to the eyeball, it actually bypasses it. And that model because it is cheaper and more efficient, and this is what we have done with concentrating so much content actually in the cloud, becomes the more dominant model these days. We still need the public internet, right? You still have to send emails and do all the other parts you do with the internet, all your business transaction and all these kind of things. But from a pure volume perspective, as we said, this is just like the 10-20%. Video content is the big part. This is actually a much smaller part of the internet than where the majority of the traffic is moving. A slide about internet exchanges. So that is interesting, right? I made a statement that the big internet exchanges are actually now flatlining, and the volume gets moved out there. But funny enough, that actually hasn't stopped other people to opening new internet exchanges. So instead of actually that you would say, well, if there is not so much growth, we might see a consolidation or a change in behavior in the market. Pretty much the opposite so far is true. More and more companies actually, either the big ones expanding, you have new players coming up, or established colo providers actually start to have their own announcements for internet exchanges and build like 10, 12 new ones all over Europe. So if at all, you actually see more a fragmentation of the market than actually a consolidation right now. Which, in that case, I guess we have two questions. How many internet exchanges do we actually need? That's also a question to the data center providers. Usually it was a very good idea as a data center provider to have an internet exchange, made your customers sticky, right? If you had the internet exchange yourself as a product, you had another product to sell, but how many do you actually need in a metro area? Because an internet exchange is very much driven by either the amount of networks you can reach or the volume you can send over it. So if you just can reach 10 people and you have 10 gig, then it's probably not even worthwhile to connect, because the volume isn't big enough. And what does that actually mean if you operate an own IX or participate in one, or you have one in your data center? If the majority of the content actually goes the cloud on-ramp, cloud, and then PNI, CDN, and it actually doesn't even bypass your IX. And that was my 15 minutes-ish. Do we have time for questions?
Of course we have time for questions. Thank you very much. Christian Kaufmann. And if you have a question, my colleague Bakir will come to you with a microphone. Yeah, the first question over there with the lady sitting on the side. Yes.
Thank you for that, Christian.
Hi.
You know each other.
Clara Massini, Edge Infra. Could you comment a little bit on the interconnection with mobile networks and how that evolves?
That is one of these crystal ball questions. Right now, a mobile provider, when it comes to interconnection, doesn't behave very different, at least for the LTE part, doesn't behave very different than an ISP if it is DSL or cable. End of the day, they have an IP network in the back end, and then they connect to the content provider via PNI, IX, depending on what their flavor is. So they look pretty much to that degree, regardless what their access level is, as a normal ISP. It is true, so, and I guess that is a leading question, that there's the big question, what happens with a 5G? What happens if a provider now, a mobile provider, doesn't aggregate all the traffic from the different radio masts together in an IP network and hand it over in one or two points in various data centers? What is actually the capability if you can make a handoff for 5G on an antenna or on a master antenna, whatever the name is, in a 5G world, and then break it out? On one side, that would give us the capability of being much closer to the end user. On the other side, it is unclear if it is actually worthwhile the effort and to which degree it makes sense. Because if you have now, I have no idea, hundreds of interconnection points potentially, then it also is more money, capex, opex, and effort involved. And is that worth it? But certainly the technology seems to go in that direction, that it is possible to do it.
Yes. Okay. We have time for one more question. Anyone? Theories, suggestions, opinions, anything's welcome.
Well, I will be around somewhere, so I can be found later.
Then I have one final question. On the conversation starter, there's still some time slots left to have a one-on-one chat with you.
There is.
There is. Okay.
I hope I get emails to actually be, because I haven't used the app. The killer app I have not used.
Oh,
I used the killer web page.
Well, if not, you can approach because you're here all day, right?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much,
Cool.
Christian Kaufmann.
Thanks.
And our next keynote will be about European data center market outlook. Mittel Patel, he's the head of European, Middle East and Africa data center research at CBRE. And last year he was figured at the best keynote of our conference last year. It's very nice to say. You get an evaluation afterwards. He was the best of last year. So high expectations. Please welcome Mittel Patel.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. So hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be back at this event, which was such a success last year. Hoping to just go through, as we mentioned, the sort of European market outlook with you guys. We're not here to talk about CBRE or pitch CBRE, apart from the fact that we do have a lounge just outside the room, so come and find us should you wish. So I just wanted to talk to you guys today just about how we see the market and some of the key trends at a fairly high level, but bring in some detail as well. So we sort of try and cover 3 sections. We'll have a look at just what the markets are doing in terms of supply take-up, the effect on absorption and vacancy. We'll cover some sort of key trends and characteristics that we're seeing in the sector at the moment, and some of them that will kind of filter through to next year. And then last year we made some predictions, a couple we got right, one we didn't, and we'll try and do the same again for 2019. And if Stein's kind enough to invite us back next year, we'll see how we do again. So just wanted to sort of start off and just sort of frame the markets as I kind of usually do. So when we're talking in this presentation, we're fundamentally talking about the multi-tenant and the build-to-suit co-location sector. Oh, my slides are in front of me, great. So we're talking about the multi-tenant co-location and the build-to-suit data center sector. We're not really looking at self-build, either hyperscale or enterprise data centers, though we will touch on those as we go. So the first thing I wanted to bring your attention to is just the incredible growth in the European co-location sector over the last few years. When we analyse Europe, we typically look at what we've called the flat markets of Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam and Paris. They're the 4 biggest co-location markets in Europe. You know, we're very interested in cities like Dublin and the Nordics as well. But for our kind of internal co-location analysis, we use flat to kind of hyponymously represent Europe. And there can't be many sectors in the world, real estate or not, that in the last 4 years, as a mature sector, have doubled in size. So the growth of the European co-location sector has been absolutely incredible. We now look at London at 529 megawatts, the biggest market in Europe and the second biggest globally. And the other 3 markets have grown very quickly as well. Just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of the numbers. So the CAGR for European market growth between 2011 and 2015 was around 10%. That almost doubled between 16 and 18 to 18%. And we expect 16% in 19 and 18% in 20, which just shows that the growth is here to stay. You know, one of the key questions we get is just, look, is this a bubble? Is this 2 years? Is this 3 years? How long will it last? Most people you speak to in the market are fairly confident about the market sustainability over the next few years, and numbers certainly represent that. And we expect further growth next year. One of the things we'll come on to is that of scale and how that growth might change from what we've seen. But certainly in terms of growth, being triggered by the incredible amount of take-up we've seen. So across these 4 markets alone, we've seen a huge amount of take-up since 2016, which we've really christened the new norm for the data center sector. The CAGR, well, the annual average take-up for 2013 to 15, as you can see, was 64 megawatts. And since 16, it's been 155 megawatts a year. With 2018, we're conservatively forecasting around 190 megawatts of take-up when our full-year figures come in, but that could quite easily get to 200. So again, just incredible growth, and we see that continuing. We get asked a lot of questions about how the different markets are performing, and actually 2018, I think they'll perform pretty much relative to their market size. You know, we expect Paris to have a pretty strong Q4 to bring it back in line with what the other markets are doing. We expect a slight dip in 19, but again, still very good compared to everything previously, and then a backup in 2020. And the reason for that slight dip is no cause of concern. We think a lot of the hyperscaling cloud companies that are driving so much of take-up have procured enough commitment this year to see them through next year. And what they'll do next year is they'll top up as and when they need, as opposed to purchasing the huge volumes they have this year. but that's certainly no cause for concern. And I just wanted to show you that the huge amount of supply and the huge amount of take-up we're seeing actually doesn't have a huge volatility on absorption rates. We now use market absorption as a replacement for vacancy rates. And what I mean is we're looking at how long would current market supply last if we saw a 5-year average for take-up and no new supply came on. So actually all 4 markets pretty healthy to where they have been. Paris is a market that we anticipate at the moment has about a year's worth of supply left in when you get to 2020. But there are certainly plenty of international developers circling around Paris, so we're pretty confident if take-up does continue in Paris and those developers will execute and that absorption line will go back up. So that's how we sort of see the numbers and stats. And I just wanted to talk to you guys now just about some of the key trends and how we see what's driving the European sector. So the first one is hyperscalers fairly predictably. I've used the term hyperscale to mean kind of cloud more generally just for this slide. We've typically seen in the last couple of years 70% of all take-up in Europe being represented by cloud and hyperscale. 2018 that's going to be 80% and we forecast 80 and 19 as well. To put that in context, around 2011, 2012 it was kind of 2 to 3%, around 14 and 15 it was 30%. So the growth of cloud and hyperscale is really driving everything. And we say that fairly repeatedly, but we can't get away from it. The scale of what these guys is doing has really taken off this year. And I'll come on to scale, but we're really now seeing double-digit requirements in Europe. We're seeing a more US-style hosting. These companies have established themselves in Europe. They're not being tentative about their footprints anymore. They're comfortable with the landscape and the market and how many servers they can sell. And so they're being more optimistic and more aggressive in their procurement of data center capacity. And the last one is I don't particularly like the term secondary markets, but in terms of framing FLAP and other markets, we're seeing secondary markets now come into play. So we're seeing hyperscalers and cloud companies circling around the big European cities and further afield, and we'll come on to that in a little bit as well. So just in terms of scale, you know, everything is getting much bigger. The scale of what's happened in Europe this year has really been quite dramatic to anything we've seen previously. In context, the average size of a data center co-location facility today in Europe is about 10 megawatts. London has about 500 megawatts of capacity and around 50 data centers that provide colo capacity. But today you're seeing data centers develop that are 20, 30, 40, even 60 megawatts of capacity quite regularly. So the scale of development has really increased, which has led to the huge increase in actual market sizing. And that's led to larger developments and larger commitments from companies as well. And again, to frame some numbers around you, in 2015, which was the last year before we really saw the big hyperscale bubble in Europe, we saw 63 megawatts of take-up in the year. And that take-up was made up of over 200 individual transactions. This year, it only took the top 10 transactions to get to over 63 megawatts. So the scale of what's happening in Europe is huge. We're now seeing build-to-suit developments becoming more regular. We're seeing double-digit transactions and 15-year commitments being more regular, which again gives us some sense of security that this is not a bubble. It's, you know, it's here to last. And this has led to a real change in mentality, I think, from developers. You know, the old way of creating and facilitating data centers in Europe of being quite tentative, of looking to secure 25 to 50% of an anchor tenancy before you built, not really speccing or fitting out much of your facility until you had commitments, is really changing, and people are much more aggressive and much more bolshy about the European landscape. So we're seeing big deployments. We're seeing almost an arms race for people to get facilities into the ground and built, because speed to market for the end user is everything now. If you've got a facility and you can develop that facility and you can deliver it to the client in 6 months, and someone else hasn't broken ground next door and it's going to take them 18 months, that speed to market will absolutely make the difference in decision making. And you know, the frenzy that we've seen in terms of market activity has led to you know, an absolute enormous amount of M&A activity in the last couple of years. In 2017, we saw $25 billion globally, which was more than 4 times the year before and more than the previous 4 years combined. In 2018, we've seen some big transactions in Europe and globally as well, and we expect that to continue in 2019. We're seeing the breadth of capital looking to enter the sector is something like we've never seen before. You know, me and myself and our teams feel calls from all kinds of investors each week, and now we're not just seeing private equity and developers looking to expand. We're seeing infrastructure funds, sovereign wealth funds, Canadian pension funds, Asian sovereign funds looking to access the markets. So myself and my colleague Paul speak to investors all the time, and it's become really competitive. But a lot of the platforms in Europe have gone. We've seen people like Iron Mountain and CyrusOne acquire platforms, really strong European platforms to build out their developments from the US into Europe. So there aren't many platforms left, and we expect a real feeding frenzy for the ones that come to market in 2019. And then just geographic expansion as well. You know, I started at CBRE in 2014, and between 14 and 16, we didn't really see many developers move from one geographic jurisdiction in Europe to another. It was quite rare, but now we're seeing new facilities and new operators enter markets all the time. It seems like the acronym FLAP is really stuck into people's heads, and people are looking for a flag in each market. And this is driven by the US companies that are looking to come over and looking for a pan-European platform, which is then encouraging the European developers to do the same. So now you've got the European and the American developers vying for position. Everyone's trying to get flags in markets and really expand their footprint as they see the data center sector grow across Europe. And then just wanted to talk about campuses. So we've seen so much growth and so much development, but probably the biggest threat to the co-location sector and co-location providers in the major cities is the idea that hyperscalers and cloud companies will look to create their own campuses. They've done this extremely successfully in places like the Nordics and Dublin, and will they look to replicate the model in the FLAP cities and beyond? Can they replicate the model in the FLAP cities and beyond? You know, at the moment they seem pretty comfortable taking co-location capacity, and even colo companies have now started to adapt business models. You'll have seen the news that CyrusOne has obviously acquired options on 270 megawatts of capacity just north of here to create hyperscale campuses as a colo provider. It's a very US-centric model that we've not seen in Europe, but it speaks to the attitude of these aggressive companies that are just looking to do everything for the end user. It's been very difficult for hyperscalers and cloud companies to create these big campuses in Europe so far, and the size of these markets, you know, is a big constraint. So I'll come on to that in a bit as well. The next is just looking at new markets. So we do spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of time talking about the flat markets. But, you know, Europe is a really big continent. There are a lot of big data center markets, and we've seen a lot of noise, particularly in 2018, around places like Madrid, Milan, Geneva and Zurich, Vienna, countries that are really big cities, big economies, big densities of population and people. And it seems like the cloud companies have now circled around those types of companies. Now, one of the questions we get asked quite a lot is where is next? And I think people expect a really formulaic sort of Einstein-type answer. But actually, look, cloud companies have got to do one thing, and it's sell servers by selling applications and platforms. And if you look at the countries in Europe and just went down a list of GDP versus population and did a list of the top 20, you know, that would probably be your list in order. It's not rocket science what these guys are trying to achieve. I feel I always cop out when I tell that to people because I think they're expecting a kind of thesis on the answer, but it really is that simple. And these big European markets, big European hubs, it's no surprise that they've become so popular because of that. We're also seeing edge strategies and things like GDPR and data sovereignty as a bit of a driver into new locations as well. The idea that some data needs to be held in country, and some governments have become a little bit stricter about where the data on their particular citizens is held. So we anticipate that, again, if a company like an enterprise or a cloud company is holding personal information, they will want some footprint in country. So if you're a bank that has got bank accounts on citizens in Turkey, say you're going to want a small colocation footprint in Turkey just to keep that data sort of in country. And then there's huge areas of Europe and beyond. You know, I think most people in this room probably have an EMEA sort of coverage. Africa, Eastern Europe and the Middle East are hugely underrepresented by the data center sector so far. But again, we have a lot of people calling us and wanting to talk about these sectors and what's viable. So, you know, definitely regions to watch for the same reason as well. And so we talked about what's driving the sector and what companies might do, but there are major constraints to development and developing in Europe. You know, the UK itself is 1/3 the size of Texas, though one small city, London, has a huge amount more colo capacity than that state. So we get American developers calling us and saying, hey man, I need 50 acres in London, get it for me. And you're just like, where? How? So that mentality is a big constraint. You know, you have to be quite creative about your doing. Companies that have been able to be more flexible have been more successful, and whether that's a bit more flexibility about location, so you don't need to be on the Slough estate in London or in Schiphol in Amsterdam, but you can go west or north. It's being more flexible about taking leasehold sites from people like Prologis and Segro rather than developing your own freehold sites, which can take time to acquire and find the right land. It's maybe forgoing an area that's not as carrier dense because you want to develop quicker and you can't find the right site. So companies that have taken a bit more flexibility and a bit more risk, I would say, have been the ones that have been able to develop faster and therefore be more successful because they've been able to serve that speed to market necessity. And we do have some constraints around freehold sites in prime locations. Power availability has come under threat. Data centers use a huge amount of power, and the more data centers we have, the more either national grids or power companies come under pressure to deliver that power. So we are seeing real threats, but so far developers have made it work, and I think that's key. People have made it work. And then Brexit, I didn't think I could get away with not talking about Brexit. The UK is due to vote in Parliament today and either sort of ratify our exit plan from Europe or not. I don't think any British person in this room has got any idea of what's going to happen if they don't ratify the deal, but we've got till Monday to work it out apparently, so plenty of time in context, given we've had two years so far. But look, actually, with Brexit, we don't see a huge impact on the data centre sector at the moment. We've not had clients say to us, look, I need to get out the UK or I need a new footprint in another country. We have had clients say, look, I'm in the UK and I want something else, maybe in Frankfurt or Amsterdam, but we haven't seen people look to replace the UK. I think ultimately we'll win some battles and we'll lose some battles. There will be people that actually need to host in the UK because they're serving UK businesses and they want to host it from the same jurisdiction, and we'll see some companies potentially move out. But we think there'll be a bit of an ultimate lag as well. Whatever happens in IT will probably happen about a year and a half after general real estate and market moves. So we certainly don't expect a knee-jerk reaction in the next few weeks, for instance. And there's an argument that some cloud demand could actually pick up, and that could feed into colo, because if banks and IT, people using IT as enterprises are looking to cut costs, they may look to relinquish surplus capacity in data centers and use a sort of OPEX model to pay leases on co-location rather than fund data centers outright. So it's to be determined, and I know that's a bit of a boring answer, but that's how we see it. So that's kind of the key trends I wanted to cover, and just a couple of slides on some of the predictions we made last year and how they panned out, and then some of the things we might see this year. So last year we said the new norm for take-up will continue. We're forecasting 190 megawatts, which I think is much more than we anticipated at this stage last year. So we've sort of won, but it's been much more than we anticipated. So I would say it's not been a continuation of a new norm. It's been the new norm plus in 2019. We thought at this stage last year there'd be a big wave of Chinese companies looking to take colo capacity in Europe. We've seen a bit of that, but we've certainly not seen the amount that I feel we thought we would last year. And there's a sense that that's still tentative and that will happen, but I don't think they've moved as quickly as perhaps we anticipated at this stage last year. Continued heightened M&A activity, absolutely. There have been processes in 2018, and there are some very competitive processes ongoing at the moment. And then Edge won't become more of a reality. And we kind of felt at this stage last year Edge was being used as a bit of a marketing tool, and it meant 10 different things to 10 different companies, and companies were using it differently, but everyone wanted to be Edge because it was a cool term. And in my view, I might be corrected, I'm happy to be corrected, but there isn't much more clarity about what Edge actually means in terms of where is the Edge, what is the Edge, what's it serving. So, if anyone has any ideas, please do find me, and potentially next year I can clear that up for people. But in my sense, it's still a bit of a grey area. So what we might see in 2019, there is a typo on that first line. It should say strong take-up, but down on 2018. We still think the take-up will feed this new norm of activity. We forecast around 135 megawatts across the four markets, which is in line with the average of 2016 onwards. So we think that will continue, but we don't think we'll see the heights of 190, 200 megawatts that we're seeing this year. I think we'll see some established sort of Western American or European providers moving into Africa. Africa is a market that can't really be ignored for much longer. We've seen a lot of people surveyed out of places like Marseille and the southern Spanish peninsula, but we think Africa will become more of a hotspot this year, and we'll see some Western providers, whether they're European or whether they're American, move into Africa and look to get a first mover advantage into that market. And we think there'll be more significant pan-European moves from developers. So I think we'll see sort of one market European developers move into new territories. So I'm talking about the types of companies that have been established in either London, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, and have only really been in that jurisdiction for 5-10 years. I think we'll see those companies look to expand geographically to compete with what the rest of the market is doing. And then to feed on to the point about kind of enterprise or relinquishing IT, I think we'll see sort of hybrid IT strategies this year driving more sale and leaseback opportunities from banking institutions, for example. So I think we'll see sort of established enterprise data centers. We'll see a couple of those come to market as co-location opportunities from the more traditional enterprise sectors. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about. I hope you guys found it useful. I'm very happy to take some questions. I think I've got a couple of minutes.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mittel Patel. Bless you.
Thank you.
And sure, we have some time for questions, theories, suggestions, opinions. Please do so. And my colleague Bakir is already next to you, giving you the microphone. Yes.
Does it work? Yeah.
Yeah. Hello.
I'm Breek Pijpers. The previous speaker was telling about 80% of the traffic comes from less than 10 networks. You were talking about 80% of the hyperscalers fill up the flap markets. I assume that these are sort of the same players. What do you think about regulation in that area? Because that's missing a little bit.
So from our sense, regulation for us as an advisory business is around GDPR and sovereignty and how that might work rather than the kind of competitive aspect. So from regulation around what they can do in terms of in-country, look, I think it's been pretty soft so far, and I think that will continue. I think countries will look to continue making their own regulations. The US and the EU works very closely to look to kind of regulate how traffic is done and what type of data can move from country to country. And from that point of view, I think that will firm up. I think the UK exit from the EU will create some questions around that, which will firm it up. A couple of my colleagues might have a more firm answer on how network regulation might work. And if you fancy joining us at our booth sort of later on, we can probably answer that a bit more directly.
Question answered? Yes? Okay, thank you. Other questions or suggestions or opinions? Yeah, over here, back here, but please hand the microphone in. Yeah, he's coming to it. Yeah. So please stand up so everybody can see you.
I was interested in the prediction about Africa. Were you referring to cloud service providers and content companies or data center operators moving more actively into that continent?
We were talking about data center operators, so co-location providers, but absolutely to serve cloud and hyperscale companies. But I think those companies will utilize co-location companies and co-location footprints as a safer way to enter a new market before they start making their own moves.
And then a second question: as you look at the flat markets, are there any sub-markets that you see developing? New areas, say around the M25 or in Frankfurt or Paris or whatnot, that are emerging as interconnection hubs where you've seen property being purchased, development activity, and new clusters of data center activity, new concentrations?
Yeah, we absolutely do, and I think for different markets you see different things. So if we take each of those individually, around London we're very established in places like Slough and the Docklands, but last year we saw a new data center company in Harlow towards the northeast of London. We're seeing eShelter, who I know who are here today, they're building a huge site in Dagenham towards the east of London. We've seen developments in the northern corridor around Welwyn Garden City and Hemel Hempstead and south as well. So I think you're absolutely right that geographic dispersion is expanding, and the connectivity will come down to the fibre providers and who digs to where, but we're seeing so much demand that we're pretty confident that these established companies will make those hubs work. If you take Amsterdam for example, there's big clusters in Schiphol, but it's becoming quite constrained. So we're seeing more developments towards the west, towards Haarlem and Plenum Park. We're seeing more developments towards southeast Amsterdam as well. For that reason, if you take Frankfurt, is probably the European market which has the tightest kind of market ring. You know, the radius of the London market is about 55 kilometres. In Frankfurt, it's kind of 10 to 15 kilometres. When you outlie E-Shelter, who have been very successful in Russelsheim. So Frankfurt actually around Sossenheim and Eschborn is starting to get a bit more constrained. We're seeing more developments in those prime areas. And then Paris as well. Paris is quite split. You've got providers like Global Switch and Interaction and Equinix in the north, and companies like Telehouse, like Data4 and Colt in the south, quite split across the city. And we're seeing that because companies are making it work for power and land in those situations. So I think that's fair.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us. Hope to see you back next year to see whether your predictions were right or not.
See if we're
Thank you very
invited.
much, Mittel Patel.
Thank you.